And despite all the guardrails that we've talked about between the US, China and its Western allies, when you consider what's happening in the economic and the commercial sphere, now the military sphere, they continue to butt heads, and this is a problem.
Yeah, so it's an escalation, as Steve Sedgwick was saying over in DC, of the language around China, and having a big China focus is very much shifting away from what it has traditionally cared about. But NATO does need to, of course, care about China, given the China threat, particularly here in Asia. So it has very much singled out China in this respect, and particularly when you talk about this decisive enabler in the war in Ukraine. When we look at some of the warnings that China has been given on this, there's been a lot of talk around the secondary sanctions, but the situation remains that Chinese companies have been very mindful of showing explicit support to Russia because they are worried about the threat of some of these sanctions. And then this really is just about warnings to China. It does stop short of any of these sanctions. There's been a lot of talk about how much these Europeans and the US can actually sanction China at this time because of worries how much that would provoke China. Of course, Biden is going in for re-election right now. There's been hesitation in reports around sanctioning China over buying Iranian oil, for instance, because of what that would do at the pump for Biden's re-election campaign. Then you've got the Europeans, of course, which are hammering out their negotiations over the EVs as well. But when it comes to NATO, China does not want an Asia-focused NATO. And it's interesting because this is something we've seen from the French as well, when there was a lot of talk, and Lin can probably talk about this as well, around a liaison office in Tokyo. The French weren't very keen on that because of the fact that they found that that was provocative. But China doesn't want Asian countries now being used as a buffer against China. So it will be interesting to see how far they go in perhaps reigniting these talks about expanding NATO here in Asia. When you look at China and when it comes to, for instance, weapons, Marty, you and I have been talking about this, and this was just before Lin was over at the Defence Summit here in Singapore, the Shangri-La Dialogue. China was talking about export controls on military equipment. Some of the biggest customers, the US, Singapore, Vietnam, Israel, and then a really fascinating part of that story, which is the China angle on Ukraine, is that the bloc had been complaining earlier this year that they weren't able to send enough weapons to Ukraine because they weren't getting the nitrocellulose from China to put into the ammunition.
Indeed, and here's the interesting part. You could make an argument that, look, China is becoming not irrelevant, but less relevant in this whole equation, enabling Russia, simply because Russia is able now to go direct to the DPRK, the North Koreans. They're going, look, hey, guys, nothing else better to do. We could use some artillery shells, right?
And Modi's in Russia right now.
Well, yeah. So let's bring Lin Lin in on this conversation. So it's interesting, as Sam was talking, that the risk of China was made so public, right, in the NATO joint communique, and there's nobody else at NATO right now who is pushing this whole line about the risk of China more than Fumio Kishida, the Japanese prime minister, who's over there. Japan, not a part of NATO, of course, but it's basically an implicit member already. And his big pitch to European countries and NATO members is, look, guys, what Russia did to Ukraine, well, China could end up doing to Taiwan, and you guys have a lot of vested interests, business interests, economic interests in China, don't you?
Exactly. And it's reflected in the communique. We've heard Fumio Kishida say it before, which is that basically you can't get security in the Indo-Pacific without security in Europe and vice versa, that the two concepts are inextricably linked. And so this is sort of, I suppose, why these Indo-Pacific partners, you've got Japan, South Korea, Australia and New Zealand, they are attending. This is Fumio Kishida's third such attendance to the NATO summit. When you look at the communique, they do have a section about the Indo-Pacific partners, and officially they talk about deepening that support for Ukraine as well as cyber defense. But when you look at some of the reporting and the commentary, there really seems to be this focus in terms of getting that deeper cooperation when it comes to the defense industrial base. when I was at the Shangri-La dialogue speaking to a number of those defence ministers, there was all these concepts about interoperability of defence systems. This would, of course, make it easier in terms of exports. There's been recently this talk that the Germans and the Dutch couldn't share artillery ammo because of this issue. So this could be one of the major topics of cooperation that could be on the agenda for these partners here. But I think from the Japanese perspective, there's just a few things worth highlighting, because we've got the elections coming up stateside with a potentially more volatile, if we do get a Trump 2.0, Donald Trump, as it relates to the NATO alliance, as it relates to the security alliance with Japan. So is this Japan sort of hedging their bets to try and get closer to European nations? And then, of course, we're talking about Japan ramping up their military spending, right, to 2%. But we're talking about a yen, which is at near 38-year lows, right? And the data is showing that basically the spend is like 40% lower when you take into account the currency, because of the fact that Japan gets a lot of their military from the US.
And a highly unsustainable debt to GDP ratio.
As well.
The last time it stands at, what is it?
276% of GDP, highest in the OECD. Yeah,
exactly.
And Fumio Kishida very much under pressure. So, it's going to be hard for him to try and, I suppose,
so, think about this.
Taxes
great point on the yen and what it's doing to Japanese defense spending plans, right? They're very aggressive. But, an F-35 right now, because the budget was based on the assumption of about 6 yen or something like that?
Yeah.
We've got dollar yen at 160-ish right now. That means every F-35 fighter jet that Japan has been planning to buy has suddenly gotten 50% more expensive. So talk about constrained, right? It's not just Europe which is having a hard time upping defense spending there.
So at the centre of all of this is the non-negligible risk of a Trump presidency and upending all the security frameworks that have been built over 75 years in the post-war period, whether it's NATO and more recently in this part of the world, whether it's the Quad or whether it's AUKUS. So there's that risk. And bringing it back to the here and now, if China has been called out as an enabler of Russia in the Ukraine war, then do we simply descend into the ritual and the familiar war of words? Does China issue strongly worded condemnation of its own against NATO and its allies, or does it get worse?
If that Tokyo office opens, we're going to hear a lot from China,
and
I
Japan.
think.
Yeah, and look, arguably it has a lot of leverage in this economically. When you talk about Trump 2.0, don't forget that China, there seems to be this sort of growing consensus out there, would prefer Trump because he's more sort of transactional in his ways, despite the fact that he's talking about 60% tariffs on goods coming out of China. But don't forget, under Trump's presidency before, there was this view that was pushing China and Japan closer together because of his trade protectionist ways. So that's another part of the angle. I think it's interesting in terms of Japan, New Zealand, Australia being present at this NATO summit. Is this going to be called NATO? North Atlantic Indo-Pacific? Because there has been that sort of acronym thrown around before, and the likely members, if there is some sort of expansion which China wouldn't like, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. But then you have countries here in this part of the world. You've got Vietnam that's taking in a huge amount of investment from China, and other countries like India perhaps that are a bit more on the fence, but not just here in Asia, also in Europe. You had France pushing back on that Tokyo liaison office, and look at the Hungarians. Viktor Orban has just been in Beijing as well.
I think that's an absolutely fascinating point, and on numerous occasions we have interviewed French commanders, we have interviewed German commanders who are training with their counterparts in this region, and it's ostensibly down to the global economy and down to the supply chains. They want to safeguard, protect and secure the supply chains, whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's the oil routes or whether it's the chip supply chains, lifeblood of the global economy. So we're increasingly seeing a tilt from Europe
supply chains
to this part of the world.
Because you got to remember, NATO countries, are they well armed? Of course they are, right? State-of-the-art high-tech equipment, yes. But, it's a long way over there to bring their gear over here should anything happen, let's say, with regards to Taiwan, right? So ahead of that, the training, cooperation, all that is important. Yes, standardization of equipment, so my bullets fit your guns. I get that. Probably what's more important, though, for the main line of defense out here in Asia, Japan, is they've got high-tech equipment as well. Yes, they need stockpiles, ammunition, missiles, etc., right? What European countries are trying to do themselves to buffer against Russia, and that is how I think that's the main way Europe and its very advanced industrial base can help Japan.
And
with stockpiling.
We've got China, who holds the key on rare earth materials, which a lot of that stuff goes into some of this military hardware.
Indeed. Okay, great stuff, guys. Thanks so much.